Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending the CAR webinar today. I am Farhad Salimi, and I'm a postdoc at CAR and will host today's webinar. Today's presenter is Associate Professor Johnston, who is a Chief Investigator of CAR and a public health physician and environmental epidemiologist, who leads the Environmental Health Research Group at Menzies Research Institute in Tasmania. Her presentation today is titled The AirRater App, How Citizen Science Can Reduce Health Impacts from Atmospheric Environmental Hazards. Faye, you can start anytime you want. We're all hearing, so I'll mute myself and stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Farhad, and thank you everyone for coming. What I'm going to do today is tell you a bit of a story about the AirRater project, a story that began in 2015 with a funding call for a sensing science type project that might bring health or economic benefits to Tasmania. So it was an exciting opportunity, and it was a bit different from standard research funding opportunities. So what I'll do today is just check I can advance the slides. Okay, what I'll do now is divide the talk into various sections. First, I'll give some background, the rationale and vision for the project, how AirRater actually works, and when we started on the journey, what we were hoping to learn. And then I'll move to what we have learned, and I'll provide some results that we've got so far about user data, environmental data, feedback from people who use the system, and some preliminary results from analysing symptom data and possible associations with various environmental measures. And then I'll wrap up by just briefly discussing where we might be going and what we have learned so far. So the rationale really came from my previous 10 to 15 years working in environmental health research, particularly in the health impacts of poor air quality and those that come from biomass and landscape fires. And in other areas, realising the big burden of disease that comes from the environment, but particularly air and air quality. So as an example, just for Tasmania, many people have got chronic, well, all over Australia, but the numbers for Tasmania with chronic illnesses of various sorts that are quite markedly affected by the environment and the air. So asthma, 58,000, hay fever, 75,000, and there's overlap in that group, of course. Chronic lung disease, 16,000. All of those conditions, respiratory conditions, are affected by air temperature, affected by air quality, and asthma, allergic asthma and hay fever in particular, affected by aeroallergens, including pollens. And then there's a whole group of people with chronic cardiovascular disease, which is influenced and can be exacerbated by poor air quality and also heat and heat stress. For this talk, I'm really focusing more on the respiratory impacts of the air that we breathe. So the question really was, can provision of near real-time information be helpful for many people in this group whose day-to-day lives can be affected by various components of the air that they don't really have any way of knowing about? So we've had fantastic service of weather forecasting from the Bureau, and particularly here in Tasmania. That kind of day-to-day spatially resolved information is fantastic for deciding, you know, what clothing you need for the day. So it's day-to-day decisions to improve quality of life. So it's less of it's a bit of a paradigm shift from waiting till there's something really bad coming and then issuing a public health warning. So traditionally, and in my other job, I work in public health protection, and we often have to think about what public health advisories we put out. But taking air quality, for example, you're not going to do a day-to-day air quality advisory on fluctuating air quality, particularly when it's within air quality standards. And yet we know from our earlier research that it just takes a small rise of particulate matter above background. It doesn't need to approach the air quality standard. And a lot of people will have quite serious worsening of their symptoms and needing asthma rescue medication, for example. But if you're in the public health department, you have to think about the entire population. You're not going to issue a warning until it's a population-wide hazard affecting a lot of people. But by that point, the people in the really high risk groups that you want to protect well and truly know about it and are already suffering. If you wait for the alert about really severely degraded air quality, you're not really being helpful to all the most vulnerable people who are affected by that. So that was the idea, was to get a sensing network. We're also blessed in Tasmania, thanks to our EPA here, of having one of the most fantastic networks that cover the population for air quality monitoring. So, you know, more than half the population, I think, are now within 5 kilometres of a well-maintained calibrated air sensor for particulate matter, which is our main air pollutant of concern. And I think 80 to 90% are within 20 kilometres of a monitor. So there were already existing infrastructure that we could build on for this project. Of course, the one that wasn't there was pollen monitoring, and that's one we had to set up ourselves. So in summary, the vision was, if we get environmental data and we put it together with symptom data, can that be useful? So can we then have a notification system for people who might find that very useful? Can we put it together to identify personal environmental triggers? And then, so that was our primary driver, but then we're collecting a novel kind of database, you know, a huge leap from what I'm used to with rigorous epidemiological, carefully designed studies. Can this sort of data be useful for learning things epidemiologically? Can it be useful for public health responses? Okay, that was the vision, and now I'm going to walk through how the system operates. So it's a mixture of cloud-based servers that collect the environmental information from various sources, and it has feeds into it and it has feeds out of it, and it communicates with an app. So the analytics and software are there in the cloud, and then the way it stands is there's various environmental surveillance. So the Bureau of Meteorology, of course, have fantastic network of monitors. The blanket network of air quality monitors from the EPA in Tasmania also contribute. We set up a network of pollen stations, and the Tas Fire Service provide geolocated data for where fires are burning. So they're the current inputs. Most are in real time, except of course pollen and fungi, because that's harder and that's counted once a day. And the platform is such that you can have more layers and more inputs very easily. Other pollutants, ozone, forecasts, and we do actually have the heat wave forecasts as a layer and available. That's of course less of an issue in Tasmania, but highly relevant in other places, and I'll talk about that later. These all go into the servers, and then spatial interpolation, and depending on what the data is and depending on what other data sources we need, but then various maps at a gridded level is produced, and then that talks to an app, and the app does two things. It collects individual symptoms, which are also geolocated, but it displays the environmental data. It can then run very simple, straightforward correlations with environmental data. That's with people who've used it a lot over some time, but it can give specific correlations, just statistical, and it can show notifications if conditions are changing. So it's not really a warning system, but it can tell you that particles have risen above background in the last hour, and that can be useful for people. But it does have the functionality if we want to draw a polygon around a population centre and send a specific notification, that's another functionality within it. And then the outputs come out to the individuals, but also it's been used in Tasmania in various ways by the health department. So the heat wave forecasts, for example, come through this system. Planning, messaging, impacts of planned burns are useful for the health department. We've been able to work very closely with EPA and in fact expand the network of air quality monitors. And this year we're also working with the Department of Environment, Lands, Water and Planning in Victoria to have another layer of smoke surveillance that actually comes from app users. and have another layer from low-cost sensor networks that children might use in a citizen science project. So that's with CSIRO and incorporating particularly fire smoke forecasts. And then this all feeds into individuals being able to manage themselves and being able to work in partnership with their health professionals to work out how they might respond to this information. So just to show you the app briefly, these are a few screenshots. That's the symptom. Because we need symptom data every 6 days, we'll ask people if their symptoms right now. Because if you only get symptoms when symptoms are present, you don't know what's going on when there's no reporting. But people can report symptoms at any time, and they can look at the layers in the top right-hand corner. I don't really have a pointer to show you, to choose to whether to look at heat forecasts or particulate matter or pollen counts. And it's displayed at the bottom of the app there. This is the symptom reporting system, which is very simple. It asks for the area affected, and we have by default nose, eyes and lungs because that's our areas of interest. But people can put their own, anything they want to monitor. It's totally open, so people can use it how they want. So a lot of people put throat. Some people monitor migraine symptoms and look at air pressure, for example, but most people, and I'll actually get to that, are people with asthma and hay fever who are particularly interested in the nose, eyes and lungs symptoms. This is an example of the map display. And then you can interrogate any station through the app. So you can look at Hobart, for example, and look at the total pollen count, or you could break that down by grass pollen or eucalypt pollen and see the previous day, the previous week, or the previous 3 months. And then, as I said before, you can look at for simple statistical correlations and see if anything comes up for you personally. So across the top are various pollens and across the bottom is cold air and air quality. And that's a simple correlation with symptoms, which in this case isn't really showing much. This is looking at station data for the previous 3 months and just showing Tassie's wonderful air quality. The top figure is PM 2.5. February, March, it's fantastic. And then on the 7th of April, when the Victorians did a lot of planned burning and the wind was blowing south, we actually got one of our significant exceedances across most of the state, particularly the north of the state that day. Now, I have hit the wrong button, so I'll just catch up. Okay, so what did we hope to learn? That's generally how the system works, but really we hope by the end of the 18 months of the project. In fact, it took longer than that, 18 months it got going, and then after another year we did our first major evaluation at the end of last year. But we want to know, is it useful for individuals? What do they think about it? Is it helpful in day-to-day management? Does it help people identify personal sensitivities? And ultimately, could it be used as a diagnostic tool? We don't know. We also wanted to know if this kind of data, very different from routinely collected administrative data, very different to standard epidemiological survey data, but crowdsourced, messy data, can you get signals from it that are useful in environmental health research? And then a particular question that came up after the epidemic thunderstorm asthma large event in Victoria was, here's another source of geospatially resolved day-to-day symptom data. Could that be useful for public health surveillance? Okay, so what have we learnt so far? We don't necessarily have the answers to those questions, but I'll come back to them when I wrap up. What I'll go through is the results we do have now on user data, environmental data, the feedback we've received, and the symptom associations that we might be able to see. So user data, it was launched in Tasmania in 2015, and I've got 3 maps here. The one on the left, map A, is the population density in Tasmania. So roughly 500,000 people, and you can see quite clearly they're clustered in the north and in the south around Hobart, the north around Launceston, and then Burnie, Devonport, with a few scattered population centres. So the map in the middle, the black dots are the locations of where people have been when they've downloaded the app over the 2-year period to the end of last year. And what was very gratifying to see was that it basically gets downloaded in a population, in direct proportion to the population prevalence. And the different blue colours on that central map are different socioeconomic areas as a marker by using family income just as a marker of that to show the variety across Tasmania. But really that hasn't affected the proportion of downloads from the highest to the lowest quintiles. And then on the right isn't user data so much, but it's showing you where the blanket network stations are, and there's another one actually on the west coast now. They're the squares, and the weather stations of the Bureau are the triangles. And then in addition to that, there's pollen monitors, 2 in Hobart, 1 in Launceston, 1 that covers Burnie and Devonport, and then a couple of background monitors in the Central Midlands and Central Highlands. So that's an amazingly comprehensive set of monitoring data for such a little population. So as of yesterday, when we checked, we had 6,000, just a bit over 6,000 unique users, and a bit over 5,000 are in Tasmania. At the end of last year, in September, we launched in the ACT, and we're approaching 1,000 users there. When people first download the app, they have a choice of how they use it. And again, this is very mind-bending for an epidemiologist. And I've learned a lot from our software developers on how apps work. But our primary aim, which informs this, is really to be a service to people who have sensitivities to the environment. And so you want an app that's not a research tool that's going to be painful. You want something that's going to be useful and not too demanding. And a lot of people don't want to give any of their details, and some people are very interested to. So it needs to cater to a diversity of interests. So when you download the app, you've got a choice. The first choice is, do you want to remain anonymous? And that's fine, and anonymous users get the entire functionality of the app, and we don't know who they are, and we can't email them. We can send messages through the app. If there's a hazard in a particular region, then anonymous, and we put a notification on the app, anonymous users will see that. But otherwise, they're an entirely autonomous group. And about 40% of people who download the app elect to do that, and the other 60% elect to register. I should say this whole project was treated as a standard university research project, went through the usual ethical reviews and data management and consents. So registered users get a lot of information and sign an end user license agreement and have a registration questionnaire where we can collect information about their age and sex, for example. So I'll show you some results of those, the 60% who registered. And all the results I'm giving only relate to Tasmania because we haven't evaluated for ACT, although we've done one evaluation survey, but we haven't broken it down. But in general, every time we have looked at these data, these kind of proportions have stayed constant over time. The proportion who register, the proportion who are female, the proportion with asthma and hay fever. So that's reassuring that that's consistent over time as new people join. So of the users, 3/4 are female, and about 10% use the app because usually they are a parent of a child with asthma or similar condition. I haven't got the age range here. It ranges from 1 to 85, but the dominant age range is really middle age, sort of 30s to 50s kind of age group, but it's a fairly even spread. And of those who register, about half say they have asthma, and 2/3 hay fever, and 35% report having both. So that's the main user base of the app. And interestingly, the contribution to symptom reporting, 95% of all symptom reports come from the group of registered users. So anonymous users, we think, and it's interesting because they're anonymous, are probably people who download the app, have a look at it, put in a few symptoms, experiment with it, and decide it's not for them, or decide they just want to use it as a way of seeing what the air quality is, but they don't want to report symptoms. So there's a whole host of reasons for wanting the information without wanting to report symptoms, but they do contribute 5% of symptoms. Then there's another choice registered users can make, which is to be a study participant. And there's information about this within the app, and about half elect to do this. There's almost no difference between being a study participant or not. The main difference is that this group, if they want to look at the app and check for conditions like air quality or pollen counts or weather or anything, a balloon comes up asking them if they have symptoms right now. So we get symptom information before we reveal the environmental conditions in that group. And it's about half. And we're now getting a database where we'll be able to see if there's any difference. With pollen, of course, you don't know what's going on. If you've got clean air quality and then you get a big smoke event, it's usually pretty obvious. But there's also times of the year, particularly in winter, where we just get a lot of fluctuating low-grade smoke, and it's actually hard to tell how different it is one day to the next. But it was important to me to have at least some attempt to collect symptom data with people blinded to what, without us saying, hey, the smoke particles are high, now tell me if you've got symptoms. Then there's a group I'm calling here dedicated reporters, and I haven't got a hard number, but it's the registered users don't report symptoms evenly, and probably about 20% of them use it enthusiastically. And then it tails off to some who use it moderately and some who use it rarely, but the dedicated reporters together probably report more than half the symptoms that the app receives. So most of our results that I'll show you later with symptom correlations probably come from this group. I suspect that most of the responses to online evaluation surveys come from this group as well. Okay, so these are showing you user activity through time, the 22-month period from when we launched to August last year. The black line are the total number of unique users through time, and the red line is the number who chose to register, and that's stayed at a fairly constant 60% through time. And the most notable things that stand out in that top panel, of course, are the two steps. And step one, sort of just after December 2015, it was January, was when Tasmania caught fire after a lot of dry lightning storms, and we had a lot of fires throughout the sort of wilderness areas out west, peat soils, and huge prolonged smoke events, particularly in the north. And the public health advice of that time was that AirRater was one way people could stay across knowing what the smoke sort of conditions were, air quality conditions. And there was a big jump in user downloads then. Then word of mouth, most people hear about it from friends and through Facebook, so there's steady increase over time. The next big jump was actually an item on the ABC News on Christmas Eve. That was December 2016. And anybody who's in the pollen business will know that whenever people in newspaper or media outlets get hay fever themselves, they tend to ring around and ask someone if there's bad pollen at the moment. So there seemed to be a lot of symptoms of hay fever affecting a lot of journalists at the time. They asked the Director of Public Health to do an interview, and then on the TV news he said, there's a really good app if you want to know what's going on with pollen. And he named the AirRater app, and then we doubled our user base overnight on Christmas Eve. It was quite dramatic, 1,000 sort of users in one hit. So that's the other step. So it's interesting what drives activity and how, as people overseeing the system, you don't really have a lot of control over it. The bottom panel then, there's two lines, a red and a black. The red at the top shows the number of active users through time, and we have a definition for active users. And we've done some sensitivity analyses around this, but we report it as a weekly average of the number of people who've used the app, whether or not they've reported symptoms. But if someone picks up the app to check air quality in their current location, the app has to interrogate the servers, figure out where they are, figure out the right numbers to report for that particular region, so we know there's been an interaction. and we call that person an active user because they've done something with the app. And numbers of active users are relatively stable from 1 to 4 weeks. So this red line here is a moving average of weekly active users. And that really helps when we get the downloads, because the black line are the number of just the raw number of symptom reports per day. And you can see, of course, the huge spikes that come when there's a high number of downloads and people are figuring out how it works and putting in a few dummy symptoms and just sorting it out. And we need a way to understand, you know, what's a symptom report that might be due to an environmental change and what's a whole lot of symptom reports because a whole lot of people have downloaded the app. So you can compare those two through time there. Okay, that's all I'll say about users, and I'll now just share some results of the environmental conditions throughout the study period. So a few Tasmanian shots here. So our classic air quality issues come from wood heaters, top left, and intermittent burns and burn-offs, a lot happening at the moment. And then the environment, a lot of native vegetation, a lot of grasses and birch, catkin, bottom left, and plantain in the middle. And our amazing, a few amazing members of our pollen team on the right. Okay, and a few figures to show you first. This first figure is of temperature and PM2.5 air quality. And if you look at the red and the blue, red is the daily maximum temperature and blue is the daily minimum temperature. Highly correlated seasonal pattern, exactly as you would expect, and a lot of day-to-day fluctuation. And then, I'm sorry, it's a bit more messy. The dotted black line is PM2.5. The scale for that is on the right. And what you can see are two clusters in the middle and to the right, which represent the winter wood smoke signal. And then you get the intermittent peaks from time to time in autumn and in summer, which represent the landscape fires. All this data I'm showing you is just for Hobart now. I'm focusing in on one region just so I can share it more easily. And then some other meteorological data through time. Relative humidity is now in red at the top, and a bit of a seasonal pattern, not as strong as temperature. And then rainfall in millimetres, and you can see Tassie sort of all year round rain, but a dry year as we know in 2017. And then this is pollens, the main pollens in the pollen count. We count, I forget how many we count, 25 or so different pollen taxa. And these are really the top 6. The top one is grasses, known as Poaceae. And Dodonaea is a bit of a bush, common in Hobart on the hills. Betula is birch, so exotic trees, well known to be allergenic. Casuarinas and cypresses, sort of pine native. Some of the cypresses are exotic, and we're actually not sure in Hobart whether it's the exotic European cypress or the local cypress pines. And the bottom is the Myrtaceae family, which mainly is eucalypts. And just some general comments. You can see one season to the next, the second season in general was a much bigger pollen season than the first that this is captured. And you can see the very, very strong seasonal signals, except for eucalypts that tend to grumble along all year round. And then I'll just show you the differences between the 3 population centres and the pollen monitors. And this is a little bit messy, but the blue is the northwest, Burnie Devonport, the orange is Launceston, and grey is Hobart in the south. And you can just see that birch, for example, is more dominant in Hobart. And because it's such a short season, we're not getting a very high count for the study period. Casuarinas and cypresses, a bit of variation north to south. Dodonaea more Hobart. Eucalypts are everywhere pretty consistently. The big one that stands out is plantain, Plantago. That might be, it's a more rural area, northwest. It might be where we've got our pollen monitor. A lot more pasture. That's a real anomaly there, so we're thinking about that one. And grasses, a very clear gradient from north to south. A lot more grass pollen in the counts in Launceston and Burnie than down in Hobart. Hobart's dominated by trees on the whole. Okay, so that's numbers of users, how they use it, environmental conditions. So the next thing I'll share is what people think about it. And we've done 3 evaluation surveys 3 to 4 months apart, roughly in Hobart in Tasmania, and one early one 3 months after launch in the ACT. And what I present now will be from Hobart. But the response rates are similar, around 25%. The highest response rate was 33%, I think, in our first one, which was coincided with the Tasmanian fires. So you can see it's why I'm sort of thinking our enthusiastic users are likely to be the ones responding here. And evaluation surveys, you click on a link, it's entirely optional. So when these are the things you need to bear in mind when thinking about these results. But we asked people all sorts of things, and although not too long because it's an app and you don't want to annoy people, but most people on a Likert scale found it very useful or extremely useful. And the features they liked the most, the clear winner was knowing what the daily pollen was doing, and then notifications when air quality was reduced in their area. And then because we did it 3 times throughout the study period, we could see how responses changed through time. And after people had used it for at least 8 months, most were confident reporting that they'd learned about how the environment influenced their health, and about 1/3 of those who responded said they'd used it to inform decisions about their self-management. And I've got a figure to show you that. Some had even discussed it with their GP. So this shows initially a free text, and then we brought themes together for the later versions of the survey, but asked if people had done anything differently as a result of information they got from the app. And blue is after using it for 1 to 3 months, the red from 8 to 10 months, and the green more than a year. So more aware of the environment and how it influences my health after 8 months of use. And then specifically use of preventive medication or changed activity or altered my environment. That encompasses things like closing the doors because it's becoming, or air quality is deteriorating or PM is going up, or deciding not to do an outdoor activity or go somewhere. And that one was particularly common in the first evaluation survey because that coincided with a lot of fires and a lot of people were using it for air quality information. And no change at all because of the app gradually diminished, as you would expect through time. And then around 10% of people who are using it in their healthcare. And some people, 8% even, said it improved their health. And so these are perceptions from users, but they're overwhelmingly positive, and there's always a free text condition, which free text comments, do you have anything to say at all? Which is wonderful to look at when you're having a bad day because these are overwhelmingly positive. So, you know, comments like, I've been telling my friends they should join, it has changed my life, how I carry on my day-to-day tasks, it's fantastic, I recommend it, I love it. But we get really helpful comments like, here, it would be good to have a regular reporting time. People would like the option to say if they haven't got symptoms, if they believe it's because they've just taken medication and that's the reason they haven't got symptoms. Having 6,000 users everywhere, we get fairly rapid feedback if there's any anomalies, and that's fantastic. So if the data in the app aren't matching data from another source, there's a lot of people who'll tell us and we can find bugs and fix them very quickly. Okay, so moving on to analysing the symptom data and then looking for correlations with environmental data. Just in that same time period, the overwhelming area of the body for which people report symptoms is their nose. And what I'm reporting now is all nose, whether it be mild, moderate or severe. We haven't broken it down to looking at severity of symptoms, but 42% of all symptom reports relate to the nose, followed closely by the eyes, and then lungs just under 20%. And a lot of people insert throat, and that was about 7%. What I'm going to show you when we did the modelling, we just restricted to modelling nose, eyes and lung reports. Okay, and as I said before, we needed a way of adjusting for the number of active users. because you can't just go on raw numbers because they change as people download the app, they change as people get sick of using the app. So this is how we did it, and this figure is the number, well actually the rate of symptom reports per average weekly users. So roughly there's like 0.2 to 0.3, 20 to 30% of active users report something each day, but it can go up to more than 1% because you can report from nose and lungs and eyes, so people can report more than one symptom in a day. The interesting thing here is there's not really an obvious seasonal trend, although the autumn-winter periods, which I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, seem to be consistent, and then the spring-summer ones are consistent. But as I showed you with the pollens, the spring and summer environmental conditions were quite different from year to year. This is a table that shows comparing symptom reports, because I was so keen to understand when and how people report and what these reports might actually mean. One of the questions in the evaluation survey is, have you had any symptoms in the last 4 weeks? So it's based on recall. And what we were able to do was look at individuals and match what they said in the evaluation survey with their recall of the last 4 weeks, and then we could look at what they actually did tell the app in the last 4 weeks. So if people said to the survey that they did not have any symptoms in the last 4 weeks, 29 people said that, and of those 29, only 1 had made a report to the app in that time. So that seemed good. People don't have symptoms. We don't seem to get a signal of spurious symptoms. And as we expected, if you do get symptoms, you're not necessarily going to spend all your time telling the app about it. So of the 185 people who recalled having symptoms in the last 4 weeks, about a third of them had entered that into the app. And then when there's episodes, so here the smoky episode I referred to earlier, we can just look at symptoms per 100 current users through time, and we can see very clear peaks associated with peaks in PM. So this is just to show you the air quality on the right and the symptom reporting rate on the left. But as I said, poor air quality is usually pretty obvious if it gets to the extent that it did on that day. But other environmental conditions are less obvious, and we got the environmental data and then ran some models, statistical models, to see what might correlate with reports. And this is restricted to eyes, nose and lungs symptoms. So we included the common pollen taxes, 5% of the annual count, which includes things like birch, which have a short but big seasonal impact. We did this separately for the Tasmanian regions, and I'm going to show you some preliminary results from Hobart. And we took the environmental data from the nearest monitoring station for the person. So Hobart, Launceston, Devonport, or the nearest air quality station, because they're if there's more than one in the bigger cities. And it's over dispersed data. We did negative binomial regression modelling. We did it for all symptoms combined. Generally, they're pretty correlated, eyes, nose and lung symptoms. But we then split it to see if there was a difference between lung symptoms, which might reflect asthma exacerbations, and eyes, nose symptoms that might reflect hay fever exacerbations. And as I said, we adjusted for the number of app users. And we tried various ways of thinking about season, and it's complicated and we're still working on it. But what we tested by stratifying by season, but in general, whatever we did, we ended up with similar results. So I'll show you Hobart, various environmental conditions listed across the bottom, and the results of the rate ratios on the y-axis, and 1 therefore being the line of no effect, and the dots representing the estimate, and the confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals, are drawn in here with the arrows. And all of these are actually just for a 1 unit change. So commonly in air quality, we do a 10-unit change in PM2.5, which is, these are preliminary, and that's probably what we will report on, but I'm just letting you know this particular figure is a 1-unit change. So the very first result on the left is for a 1 microgram per cubic metre increase in PM2.5, which showed about 1/3% increase. So that would be roughly a 3% increase for a 10-unit rise. And very tight confidence intervals because it's such a small increase. Not much of a signal with the maximum temperature and a lot of variation, as you can see by the confidence intervals. Reassuringly, there was an inverse association with humidity and temperature, and cold, dry air is known to make, you know, cold air and runny noses are well-recognised phenomena, but also other symptoms. Not much of a signal with rain on its own. And then some pollen results, which all tended, these common pollens, to have a positive association. Grasses, the cypresses, eucalypts crossed 1 and was fairly wide, more variation, and birch is the final one. And then I'll show you the same results for nose, eyes clustered together and lung symptoms clustered together. And this one is a bit busier, but same environmental exposures and generally the same spectrum of results for these symptoms, but there were 3 where it did look different, and we need to explore this a bit further. But for PM2.5, the signal seemed to be a lot stronger for lung as opposed to nose and eye symptoms. Whereas for the pollens, what's going? Sorry, I'm just, there we go, sorry. So this is grass pollen, and here on the top line, nose and eyes, we're seeing a much clearer signal than on the bottom line, which is lung symptoms for grass pollen. And similarly, even more so in fact for birch pollen, seemed to be a much stronger driver of nose and eye symptoms rather than lung symptoms. Okay, so that's sort of a hodgepodge of what we've learned so far. Where we're going is there's all sorts of possibilities, but in the immediate term, we're supported from the Health Department in Tasmania and ACT Health to continue the service in Tasmania and in the ACT. And the NT-EPA is supporting us to launch in the top end of the Northern Territory this year. And there, Tasmania, of course, it's been air quality and pollen, but top end of the NT, the heat and the heat forecasts and the humidity and symptom correlations are of interest. So we're excited to see how AirRater might work for an entirely different environmental exposure, including, of course, smoke up there with their annual savanna burns. And in partnership with CSIRO and the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, we're working on a DELP-funded project to use AirRater in Victoria, and that's this year. That's a basic version of the app, but it's got new functionality in that CSIRO have got a citizen science school education sort of STEM activity where kids are going to build their own sensors, and they'll be dispersed around the community, and we'll be able to feed that into the app. And another feature is you can tell the app if you can see or smell smoke. And Grant and Chris are also using the phone, if you can see a smoke plume from a bushfire in the distance, to photograph that. And then the app can grab the vector of where you're looking as well as the image. And then you can get multiple vectors on a map, and where they all intersect, you can do a density plot. And this is very exploratory, but we're seeing if we can draw smoke density plots based on people taking photos of a fire from a whole lot of locations. So that's a bit of fun and a new innovation that we're exploring in Victoria, along with incorporating forecasts by the CSIRO AFX model, which Martin Cope is leading. And we've got various grants other ways to do a lot more rigorous evaluation of all sorts of aspects of the app, to test if these epidemiological associations that we've seen, that I showed you, are actually clinically real. And you can do that with aeroallergens. You can do tests on people's blood with the pollen to see if they've actually made IgE against a pollen. Even if we don't have a clinical antigen, we'll be able to see if it's biologically plausible that, you know, the native cypress is a cause of symptoms, or the eucalypts. You know, that was a bit of a borderline association, but we can test that directly. Using the data for individuals, we're exploring that to see if it is a plausible way of identifying not only if it's smoke versus pollen, but the particular kind of aeroallergen. We're going to do some studies, we hope, to figure out, using DNA to figure out which sort of cypress, or, you know, the counting pollen, you can't always tell species. And so far our user evaluations have really been based on response to surveys, and that's good, but it has its limitations. So detailed evaluations, something we have planned for the next year. And also in partnership, all of these are in partnership with the health departments of Tasmania and the ACT, and also to test the system as a respiratory surveillance system. And we're contributing to collaborations with others who are leading on developing pollen and air quality forecasts, especially in Victoria, and possible novel ideas for automated detection of pollen, because it's very labour intensive and expensive the way it is. So of course our challenge is sustaining the service, because it's, aspects of it, particularly the pollen, are quite expensive, and we're very keen to maintain it as a free public health service, because that's the ethos and the whole idea. So we don't want to charge users. And it's interesting, the moving goalpost software is always being upgraded. There's endless amount of IT needs and upgrades that are ongoing. And interestingly, the Cambridge Analytica effect. So we had trouble getting the last 2 versions approved by Google Apps, for example, because of the fallout from this. So we were collecting age and sex. They said that's personal information. They didn't really care that that it was voluntary. It was only registered users, and that we had ethical approvals. In the end, we won the case on that. Then they rejected it again because of the geolocated data, and we had to argue that we're providing a service that required that. So these things are interesting. Okay, so I had a lot of questions about what we were hoping to learn at the beginning, and here I've got some possible answers. The first question is it useful for individuals? And I think I'm very confident to say very clearly, yes, the feedback is consistent, and it's consistently positive, and people use it to make all sorts of decisions. But we need, does it help you really identify? We need some objective measures of how well it identifies personal triggers. There's a lot of people who thought they were allergic to pollen, for example, who now quite clearly know that it's more smoke and fluctuating air quality that drove their symptoms. But these are anecdotal. So I can't say that it's in any way ready to be considered diagnostic, but we do have some grants in the system to try and test that. Is it useful for environmental health research? I think the answer at this point is possibly. The data are very different, and we're doing a lot of work to try and understand what the symptoms report mean and how they change through time and fall off. The difference between the participants and the registered users. So it's possibly useful. It's kind of looking like it might be promising, but we need a bit more work to do there on that front. And whether it's a useful source for public health surveillance, that's something we're going to test next year, and I can't really make a comment at this point. So I think that brings me to the end. So thank you very much for listening. I really need to acknowledge the most amazing and wonderful team of people I've ever worked with, because AirRater is big and complicated and requires diverse skills, from data and IT to palynology and ecology and fire, and understanding how to coach people through apps, responding to people's queries through the apps. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank the entire team. It's been a very different kind of journey for a researcher, but it's been a fun one, and there's lots more directions we can go in. So I'll end there, open for any questions. Just to let you know, it's snowing in Tassie already. This is one of our mountains, but I'll stop and hand back to you, Fahad.
Thank you, Faye. It was a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed. Now it's time to take a few questions. And can I ask all just use the chat section at the bottom of the GoToMeeting panel to type your questions. Then Faye will read them loud and answer your questions. And I have a question myself, Faye. You touched on the recording of geolocation, and Google was not really happy with that. Are you now recording geolocation of the users as they go about their daily activity?
No, we don't do that. But when they look at the map to see what the conditions are in their location, we record that geolocation. And about once every 4 days, and this is with consent in the app, we just log their geolocation so we can correlate that with environmental conditions at a time that they're not reporting. Understanding they still might have symptoms then, but it gives us a bit of a sense of conditions when people aren't reporting versus conditions when people are reporting.
Sure.
So they're the two circumstances where we log it.
Yep. And in terms of the financial support, have you thought about making it sustainable in a way, like financially sustainable? Just say, for instance, by running ads or something like that as well?
Yeah, we're endlessly thinking of ways to do it. It's been going for a few years and we're still sort of setting up and figuring out what's the most useful. That is a possibility, and it's a question, and we do get approached from people who are interested. We would consider it carefully at the time when that might look real. We're not at that stage yet.
Sure. We have a couple.
We've got to be careful what we promote because our ethos is promoting public health.
Mm-hmm.
So we would be very careful about doing something that might not be compatible with that ideal.
I understand, yeah. We have a couple of questions, Faye. If you can read them loud and answer, would be great.
Okay. How many? Yeah, I've tried to work that out. So the question is, hi Faye, do you know how many of the total asthma sufferers in Tasmania took up AirRater? And I've worked out that it's probably around 1%. But that's people who've ever had asthma varies quite a lot in how you define it, and that's very ballpark figure. So 5,000 users in a population of 500,000, where 10% might have asthma, that's roughly where we're at. If this translated into New South Wales, we'd have about 50,000, 60,000 users. So there's scope for more, and I think the people who need it most use it the most intensively. So someone with a past history of asthma a while ago might not find it as useful as someone with active sensitive symptoms. That was from Catherine. From Anthony. Relationships between low humidity and cold air and symptoms. That's really well known for runny noses. If you go outside on a cold winter's day, a lot of people just get a reaction to the cold. I think with asthma, I don't know if guys on the respiratory physicians who can talk to relationships. I think there are circumstances where high humidity and temperatures can be irritating and cause symptoms, and there's situations where very low temperatures and low humidity can cause symptoms, direct irritation effects. And I think Tassie being a cold place, we saw the link with the cold, dry air with the minimum temperatures. Okay, from Bijan in Iran. I'm wondering, is there any detailed report available on the app functionality? I'm glad you asked, Bijan. Our first paper that reports the first evaluations of the app and how it works and some preliminary environmental results is published, and it's freely available online, and I can send the link, maybe through CAR. If you look on the CAR webpage, actually, it gives a link to where the report is, and on the CAR Facebook page, or you could Google environmental atmospheric hazards and smartphones, and you'd find it that way.
Any other questions, anyone? Still have another couple of minutes. If not, and Faye, if you don't have, yeah, Sharon, I think still
Sharon has shared the link.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if Faye, you don't have any more comments to add, then maybe it's time to end today's webinar. And I thank you again, Faye, for the interesting presentation on the AirRater app. And thanks to all the attendees. And I would like actually to add that today's webinar has been recorded and will be available on CAR website at one point. So if you didn't manage to listen to it, so feel free to go to CAR's website in a couple of days and it should be available there. And someone asked, are you happy to share the slides? So it has been recorded, so all the whole presentation will be available on the CAR website. And I'm not sure, Faye, are you happy to share the slides as well or not? But
yep, some of them are preliminaries, but in general, yes, and I'm certainly happy for the presentation to go on the web. Just understanding their preliminary results, so they may yet change.
Sure. Thanks again, Faye. Thank you to all who attended. Have a great day, everybody.
Okay, thank you. See you.